Welcome in to episode 3 of Next Level. I'm your host, Tommy Ashley. That's Greg Barnes. Special guest today. We'll get right into it. I'll let Greg start the festivities.
Well, if you've paid attention to ACC sports in the last several decades, right, David, you probably recognize David Teel. David has been just the standard bearer for ACC sports media for a long time. Primarily focuses on Virginia Tech, but he has become in the last couple decades the kind of the lead ACC writer, if you will, in terms of if you want to know anything about what's going on in the ACC, whether it has to do with expansion or finances or any of those things, David has his ear to the ground better than anybody. Tommy, we've talked a lot in the last couple of months since I stepped off the beat. I was on the beat for 15 years, which is a long time. It felt like a long time to me. David is a columnist for Richmond Times-Dispatch now. But earlier this year, David was awarded the Virginia Sports Writer of the Year for the 14th time. So in terms of a legacy and kind of what he's meant to the ACC footprint, I can't praise David enough. So David, thank you for joining us for the Next Level today.
Too kind of an introduction, Greg. I assure you. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And David's just always been a great guy. Anybody has any questions about anything, whether you're going to Blacksburg or Charlottesville, David's always provided a helping hand. So it's good to have people like David in the industry. You've got a lot to write about this year. Virginia Tech and Virginia with new programs. Of course, North Carolina is playing Virginia this weekend. And we're gonna touch on that game for sure. But I just wanted to get initially your thoughts on kind of the program changes, both with Tony Elliott, of course, at Virginia, and Brent Pry at Virginia Tech. How you think those guys maybe have done through the first half of the season and through their first year as head coaches of those programs.
Well, Greg, it's really not breaking news. They've struggled for varying reasons. But I think Virginia's are more of a surprise simply because of the returning talent that the Cavaliers had on the offensive side with Brennan Armstrong and that core of receivers. You're talking about a team that averaged nearly 35 points a game. Last season, Brennan Armstrong set the ACC single-season record for total offense per game, well over 400 yards, broke Lamar Jackson's record from his Heisman season. But this year, the Cavaliers aren't even averaging 16 or 17 points a game. They're in the high 16s, and they've yet to score more than 20 against a Power 5 opponent. Heck, last year in a quarter at Carolina, they scored 21. But it's been a struggle for them. And then I think Virginia Tech's issues were more expected. Justin Fuente was dismissed for a reason. The talent base was down, and Brent Pry has not had much time at all to fix it. And the Hokies are riding their first 5-game losing streak since 1992.
Yeah, it's phenomenal kind of what's happened. And Virginia, it's mind-boggling to me because last year they were very similar to North Carolina in that they had this explosive offense, as you laid out, but their defense really wasn't any good. And yet this year, Virginia's done the opposite, right? I mean, it's like Rosinski comes in from Air Force as defensive coordinator and has done a bang-up job, even though he doesn't have an offense really to protect him. And yet, as you say, Brennan Armstrong, I think his quarterback rating last year was 156. It's 112 right now. How much of that is just the offensive line? How much of that is the Robert and I factor? Because he goes to Syracuse, and all of a sudden Syracuse offensively looks like a different animal.
Yeah, the transition in offensive staffs clearly has been anything but seamless. And Tony Elliott concedes that it is a much more balanced approach that requires more nuance and more progression reads from the quarterback and his receivers, and they have not grasped it yet, not even close. I mean, they played Miami last week, and neither team managed a touchdown. When you don't allow a touchdown, you're supposed to win the darn game. In fact, it's the first time since 1980 that Virginia has lost a game in which it did not yield a touchdown. And you mentioned John Rudzinski coming from Air Force as the defensive coordinator. Cavaliers have been very good at all three levels on that defense. They've got a grad transfer from Miami of Ohio, who's been real good on the defensive line. Nick Jackson is having another all ACC season at linebacker. And really the big upgrade has been on the back end. Their corners are excellent. Anthony Johnson is a second-year transfer from Louisville. Ventrell Cypress has played much better, and the safeties led by Antonio Clary have also been good.
I feel like I'm sitting here with two legends. It should be the David Teel Sports Writer of the Year award, awarded to David Teel in Virginia, and then, of course, with Greg. David, let me ask you, this Virginia team, last year you mentioned the offense was great. Brennan Armstrong was great. You've covered a lot of football and a lot of teams over your years. Have you ever seen, like Greg mentioned earlier, a flip?
No.
I mean, it's the same guys. The offensive line's a little different, but
Yeah.
I mean, just what's the mood up there at Virginia?
Frustration, confusion. You can see it in the players' faces. I mean, they know what they're capable of. They did it last year, and we've mentioned the offensive line, and those losses were real. I mean, more than 150 career starts walked out that door in the offseason, either through graduation or the transfer portal. And you've got guys who hit the portal who are now starting on the offensive line at Michigan and Southern California. I mean, quality players who were replaced by guys with no career starts at Virginia and by graduate transfer from the Ivy League. And no offense to the Ivy League, but that's not the Power Five. So the offensive line has been a huge problem.
David, watching a little bit of that Miami Virginia game this past weekend, I couldn't help but to think back to the beam that Lauren Brownlow has kind of made famous over the years of Frank Beamer at the end of the 2014 Wake Forest Virginia Tech game. It's 0-0, and Frank is arms raised, all excited. That's a classic. In terms of this game this weekend, I know the spread is minimal just because North Carolina's defense has really not been good, even though they are getting better. I guess the spread's still maybe 7, maybe a little bit more than that, 10 now. How do you see this game playing out? And is this a game that you think Virginia can realistically win?
Greg, I've seen awfully talented Carolina teams come to Charlottesville.
Fair.
And flop, right? I mean, and not in the too distant past.
Right.
So that would give me pause. I mean, if you go strictly on performance this season, the Tar Heels should win. And I mean, my gosh, Drake May's numbers are off the charts. I mean, he's on pace to set an ACC single season record for passing efficiency. He's ahead of Jameis Winston's pace from 2013. I mean, Winston will always be the gold standard of freshman quarterbacks in this league, if not the country. You go to 14-0, you win the national championship, you win the Heisman, you can't get any better. But Drake May's numbers are comparable to what Winston had back 9 seasons ago. And it's not inconceivable that he would break Kenny Pickett's touchdown pass record in a season from last year. He's at 29 now, and Pickett's record is 42.
Let me ask about obviously Drake's a homegrown guy from North Carolina, but how has Mack Brown's return to North Carolina damaged the Virginia programs? We talk about the Virginia pipeline and recruiting. That's a real aspect of it, and a lot of talent leaves Virginia. With Pry and Elliott there now, they've got to correct that. But from covering it, how has Mack damaged the programs up there specifically?
North Carolina has been damaging Virginia programs for decades, guys. I mean, you go back to Lawrence Taylor and Chris Hamburger. They're in the Pro Football Hall of Fame, and they came to Chapel Hill from Hampton Roads. And Mack in his first go round at Carolina, like Dre Bly and Tommy Thigpen, who's on the staff now, right? You know, they're sitting there as assistants now, recruiting their old stomping grounds. And I went back, you know, after you guys were kind enough to invite me yesterday, I was looking at the last couple of recruiting classes. What Carolina has 6 commitments in the 23 class, I believe, from the Commonwealth, and 7 in the 22 class. You know, the signees were from Virginia. So it is not unusual. It has continued to trend. And in the social media internet era, college football and basketball recruiting, it's national. It's not regional anymore. The notion that Carolina and NC State can put up a fence around the Carolinas or that Virginia and Virginia Tech can put up a fence around the Commonwealth, that's not going to happen.
What's the key for Virginia and Virginia Tech to, while you can't build that wall, you can do a little bit better? And I know Penn State, since Franklin's been there, they've done a really good job coming down. Al Groh, I guess at least his first several years, he seemed to do a really good job keeping the homegrown talent home. But it seems like really beyond him, I know Beamer had some success, but even he was kind of more of a development guy. What do you think the key is for Virginia and Virginia Tech to do a better job with that?
Well, it starts with relationships at the high school level, and both programs have made it a priority. They are in those high schools, whether they have prospects or not. It's PR work, right? It's just boots on the ground, and visibility equals credibility, and that's what they're working on. And that was a huge knock, especially against Justin Fuente and his staff at Virginia Tech, and to a degree, Bronco Mendenhall and his group at Virginia, because Mendenhall arrives in Charlottesville from Provo, Utah, and essentially brought his BYU staff with him. They had no ties. Now he wisely retained some people led by Marcus Hagans, the receivers coach, who's an effective recruiter and position coach, and a Virginia graduate, former player there. But now these coaches, I mean, Tony Elliott, having worked at Clemson, he knows how good the talent in this state has been and can be. It's not as good as it used to be, but those things are cyclical. It will come back. And Brent Pry has a lot of Hokie alums on his staff now.
Wanted to ask about Mack Brown, because we don't get much of an outside view on Mack dating back to his previous tenure. What were your thoughts when Carolina decided to bring Mack back, and kind of how do you think that's gone, and kind of the opinion from maybe outside the Chapel Hill region?
Honestly, I was skeptical. And how many years was he away? And in the studio up in Bristol, and I thought, is this going to work? And I feel like I can say this because I'm 63, and so it's not ageism on my part. I'm thinking, does he have the energy to do this again? Because I can't imagine the all-encompassing nature of being a major head football coach in college, or in the college level right It's just got to be almost suffocating. And he has managed it. Now, was last season a huge disappointment for Carolina and its fan base? I would think so. You had almost a generational quarterback in Sam Howell, and you can't muster better than 6-6 because you can't stop anybody. Well, he set to rectifying that during the offseason and clearly got off to kind of a staggering start there. But as you mentioned, the defense seems, in conference play, seems to be getting better. Maybe it's because App State's not on the schedule anymore, but they've been good. And that fourth quarter last Saturday night against Pitt, I was home in time to watch that. Down 10 and then to close on a 28-0 binge. That's impressive stuff.
They've certainly made some strides in that area. And you're right, they've been solid, if not good, in ACC play on defense. And we're talking with David Teel, Richmond Times-Dispatch, and legendary sports writer. David, let me ask you about the state of the ACC. I interviewed, along with Joey Powell, several weeks ago, Chancellor Guskowitz here at North Carolina, and he talked about the desire to keep the ACC strong. In your opinion, what is the state of this conference at this time? And going further with that, North Carolina and Virginia's place in the expansion talks and all that.
Well, North Carolina and Virginia are two of the ACC's signature brands. They're charter members. And, this is a gigantic if the ACC ever splintered and schools were looking for soft landings in really attractive conferences, neither the Tar Heels nor the Cavaliers would have to worry. There aren't a whole lot of other ACC schools that could stay the same. But that said, I think the ACC is on pretty good footing. Now, when USC and UCLA announced their move back in the summer, I think everyone was taken aback. I talked to ACC administrators who were just in total survival mode. What are we going to do? Who's looking at the grant of rights for escape clauses and what can be done? But you look at the recently announced Big 12 TV deal. By the time that kicks in, I think the ACC's finances will be in much better shape than the Big 12's. And I think they'll be better than the Pac-12's. The ACC's never going to catch the SEC and the Big 10 financially. It's just not. There are too many demographic disadvantages. They don't have the fan bases. They don't have the huge alumni or huge enrollments that drive television ratings. And that's just how revenue is produced these days. But as long as the ACC doesn't fall too far behind, and as long as it feels like it can continue to compete at the highest levels, which it is now, then I think there's a very good chance that the conference remains stable.
David, I've been asking for years, what does the ACC have to do? I agree with you. They're not going to be able to catch the SEC or the Big Ten. But what can they do to maybe close the gap so it's not as glaring?
Sure.
And it doesn't matter what administrator I talk to. They say, well, really the only team that can move the needle for us financially is Notre Dame.
Yeah.
I see Notre Dame as a complete pipe dream. What's your view on that?
Greg, my thought on Notre Dame has long been there is only two potential reasons for the Fighting Irish to relinquish football independence. One, playoff access, lack thereof. Well, that reason is now cast aside. They're moving to a 12-team model, either in 24, 25, or 26. It's going to have 6 automatic qualifiers and 6 at-larges. That's 2 more at-larges than we have now with the 4-team playoff. So Notre Dame's not joining a conference because it has a problem making the playoff. The other is an inability to schedule. if suddenly, and I don't anticipate this, the major conferences started moving to 10-game conference schedules to appease their television partners and to drive inventory, that would compromise Notre Dame's ability, I think, to schedule the national teams that it aims to have each season. But until that day comes, I just don't see it. Notre Dame freely admits it leaves money on the table by remaining independent. It would, the Fighting Irish would make more money if it joined the ACC than it would from its NBC package and its partial ACC membership. And heaven knows they'd make a ton more money if they went to the Big Ten. But that is not what drives decisions in South Bend. And I'm not even sure Jack Swarbrick and his team in the athletic department would have the final say here. I think this is an institutional decision that comes from the top, the presidential and the board level.
A lot of pride there for sure. One other question on this topic, and we'll let you go, David. You mentioned when the news came out last summer about USC and UCLA, there was some panic. We experienced the same thing. We heard kind of the same details. But as you start looking at it, when you see that USC and UCLA, and really before them, Texas, Oklahoma, they were the bigger ones in terms of they're going to break their rights package with the Big 12 so they can jump to the SEC quickly. Well, that didn't happen.
Correct.
And they're going to go to the end of their contract. USC, UCLA is going to go to the end of their contract. And so everybody keeps saying, well, somebody's going to test the ACC's greater rights because it goes through 36. I agree that likely maybe somebody will try it, but that seems like a pretty ironclad contract. Do you think somebody will try to test that anytime soon? Is there much value in trying to do that, given that there is a exit fee in addition to losing those rights?
Right, an exit fee on top, right?
Yeah.
No, it would be so cost prohibitive, Greg. And in these economic times, I just don't see it. And if it was going to happen in the near term, I think it already would have. I think the lawyers have parsed that document, and it's only a handful of pages. It's not like the Manhattan phone book used to be, or anything like that. But it appears to be very, as you say, buttoned up and ironclad.
That is David Teel, Richmond Times-Dispatch. David, a lot of knowledge there. My takeaway from the expansion discussion, and I think folks that listen to this podcast and this YouTube show need to know, is that North Carolina will be all right either way.
Yes.
And they are a crown jewel in the ACC, and it'll work out for the Tar Heels. David, I think I speak for Greg. Thank you so much for taking your time to join us and joining the next level. And we hope to talk again soon.
Tommy and Greg, thanks so much.
Thank you, David.
Greg, I think, first of all, I just sat back and enjoyed you guys and y'all's discussion there. But a couple points there. I mentioned that with the expansion in North Carolina, but to the specific game at hand this week, his point about plenty of good Carolina teams have gone to Virginia and struggled. I think that's what gives folks pause, right?
House of Horrors, right? I walked right into that one. Yeah, if you go back to, I guess it was maybe 19, and Mack was asked about that 96 loss in Charlottesville, and he just completely brushes that. That happened so long ago; it's not relevant. And I think that's really what you have with this fan base, is because the curse was broken a long time ago, when Butch was here. And so there's a lot of young people, 30s and younger, who really don't see what the big deal is. And then you get the old heads, me and guys older, who remember some of those good Carolina teams going up there and losing. So we'll see. It's Scott Stadium is a fantastic place to watch a ball game. When they're engaged, that fan base can be loud. So no doubt Carolina has to bring their A game. I mean, let's look at how competitive some of these games have been. I mean, I know they beat Pitt by 18, but as David said, Carolina was down 10 in the third quarter, and Carolina just opened up in the fourth. So Carolina's going to have to play well. And with Virginia having a really good defense, they still have Brennan Armstrong. And yeah, that whole offense has been a mess, but maybe they can find some rhythm. I mean, Carolina's defense did it late against Pitt, right? They got hot. So who's to say Virginia can't do that? So it's a road game. It's in Charlottesville. It'll be a tough one. Carolina has to come prepared. Somebody mentioned it's a trap game. I don't know about that, but I mean it kind of fits because it is before the big game against Wake Forest next week. So it'll be a fun one to watch. But after watching the Virginia-Miami game, it's tough to envision Carolina stubbing their toe that badly.
Yeah, really. 1980, I think Virginia, like David mentioned, they lost to Rutgers 3-0. And then you go and nobody touches the end zone until a 2-point conversion for Miami to win that game. Greg, one thing folks forget too as well, and we've discussed this with Maryland getting out of the conference in basketball, but it won't be that way this Saturday, of course, but it used to be a nasty, nasty place to play too. Not just the football team, but the fans and all that. I remember Ronald Curry committing to Virginia and then switching to Carolina and then shows up on the sidelines there up in Charlottesville. And I know that was before your time covering the Tar Heels, but we all remember how just brutal the atmosphere was. A little bit has changed, but yeah, I don't think folks realize that, do you?
Yeah, and the fact that conference expansion, I think, I don't know if ruin is the right word, but when there used to be just 8, 9 teams, there seemed to be just tighter rivalries. Maryland's always a tough place to play. NC State was always good and was a tough place to play, still is. Virginia, as you mentioned. But now that you've got more teams that have kind of flooded in, you've kind of shifted some rivalries. Of course, Virginia now is so deep with Virginia Tech as its rival in the ACC. Yeah, that wasn't the case when Ronald Curry was playing. So some of these things have kind of shifted it. But the fact that Virginia has struggled a bit, I know they won the Coastal Division, 3 years ago with Bryce Perkins. But they just haven't been as good of late. And Carolina, of course, hasn't been to that level really either. So the rivalry's not as heated as it once was. But as we talked about, if Tony's able to get that program kind of back in terms of where they're actually competing for recruits with Carolina, that's where you start to have a lot of that local interest, and that's where you start to rebuild that rivalry a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, Mack talks about making Carolina the cool place to play, and they always talk about Drake May was born to play in North Carolina, but Virginia's been loaded with talent, the state of Virginia, and they just haven't been able to take advantage of it, either Virginia or Virginia Tech. Carolina in Charlottesville on Saturday at noon. Greg Barnes and myself will be back for the game plan live on Thursday night. We appreciate you talking or visiting with us here on Next Level, Inside Carolina's new YouTube show. If you've got any topic ideas, I know we'll have an NIL show at some point. We'll have some other things going on, but certainly send Greg or myself a suggestion or put it on the message boards or hit us up on Twitter. Greg Barnes, appreciate it, my man.
All right. Thanks, Tommy.